Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earle. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearle.com. In today's interview, I interview my wife, Natalie Earle. Natalie is a certified functional nutritional therapy practitioner who helps individuals with acne, low mood, and low energy to experience more confidence, vibrant energy, and clear skin. Her journey started with soothing the aftermath of childhood trauma, which manifested as acne, PTSD, anxiety, depression, eating, and gastrointestinal disorders. Natalie began learning more about gut health and the benefit of nutrition therapy to improve mood and energy. She's lived the connection between gut health, skin health, and psychological well-being by changing her nutrition and reversing food intolerances. So without further ado, here's my interview with Natalie. All right, Natalie. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Andrew, for having me.
So today you want to tell our listeners a bit about IBS. So how about we start with what is IBS and why might it be relevant to somebody listening to this podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, IBS stands for irritable bowel syndrome. And it actually is kind of known in the conventional medical world as a functional diagnosis. So it's often when the gastroenterologists or your doctors don't really know exactly what is going on. And so their last resort is to call it irritable bowel syndrome. Other disorders that are in this category are things like chronic fatigue syndrome, and most people don't have there's not a clear understanding of what is actually the disease in this situation. And it's very similar to a lot of the symptoms that are a part of IBS are things like abdominal pain and bloating, chronic diarrhea and constipation. Sometimes people lean more towards one or the other. But often there's cases where there's a mixed case of both diarrhea and constipation. And so people often get IBS mixed up with irritable bowel disease, which is IBD. And IBD is actually a little bit more of it's an umbrella term that incorporates a lot of these other specific diseases that we do know the cause of, which those are things like ulcerative colitis and as well as Crohn's disease, microscopic colitis. Those are a few to name. And those are really just inflammatory diseases. As a functional medicine nutritionist, I have a little bit more of a comprehensive systemic view of the body. And so when your gastroenterologist would say, I don't know what's causing your IBS, and we've ruled out IBD, so you don't have that inflammatory, those maybe an autoimmune disease that's contributing to these symptoms, a functional approach would look at something called dysbiosis, and that is really just a term that means an imbalance of the gut microbiome. And that's really a root cause of so many other diseases. Hippocrates, who's known to be the father of medicine, is well known for quoting that all disease, and I like to kind of break that up. It's a disease, but it's also when our body's out of ease. And so that all stems from the gut and our microbiome, which is the environment of bacteria and protozoa, all different kinds of symbiotic organisms that we live with inside of our gastrointestinal tract. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's really important for people to know the difference. And it's difficult to actually diagnose, but it's actually quite simple to resolve with nutrition.
Sure. And I'd love to get into the gut dysbiosis piece. But before we do that, how is IBS diagnosed, or is it diagnosed? It sounded like from what I was hearing there, it's when one doesn't have IBD, they don't have Crohn's disease, something like that, then they might be just diagnosed with IBS. Was I hearing that correct?
That's correct. That's usually the standard of diagnosis for IBS is, I think the criteria, it includes abdominal discomfort, pain lasting at least 1 day per week for the past 3 months, connected to at least 2 of the following factors: defecation causing pain and discomfort, changes in defecation, and stool consistency alterations. So it's kind of a broad diagnosis, and that's where they do want to rule out any other things. But most people with IBS actually have very healthy blood work, so they're not going to be seeing the antibodies present and inflammation present systemically at that time. And so, we're starting to see IBS is actually a very, very common disease. And why it's so important for your listeners too is that anxiety is a huge, a lot of people used to believe that IBS was just psychosomatic. So people would have anxiety and then it would cause, because there is a gut and psychology connection, and we do get this gut feeling and gut actual physiological response to feelings of anxiety. And yet that does not mean that there's not something actually going on in the gut that is contributing to these symptoms. And they're starting to see that more now, that it's no longer classified as psychological disorder.
Yeah.
And it's a lot more prevalent today than it used to be, partly because of our modern life, I think.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and as you know, I've not been diagnosed with IBS, but I've had chronic stomach issues that are relatively similar to Crohn's disease. I went to a gastroenterologist, and they could not give me a diagnosis back in high school, and ultimately, I don't think they gave me a diagnosis, and I just thought, well, I guess I'm making a big deal of these symptoms, but they were, I have broken bones in my life, but this was the worst pain that I'd ever dealt with before. And when I learned about Crohn's disease, I was like, well, it sounds what I had similar to Crohn's. But anyways, I was thinking about that as you were talking about anxiety, because I know for me, when these stomach episodes would come on, I would feel a great deal of anxiety. I always kind of viewed it as like a reciprocal relationship. I'm sure the anxiety made the stomach pain worse, but from my perspective, it wasn't just the anxiety, because I have a lot of friends and family who are psychotherapists, and they always made that connection. Well, are your stomach aches more anxiety based? And I think that was a piece of the pie for me, but like based off my lived experience, it seemed like it was more a digestive issue relating to nutrition. And I've actually significantly reduced it, thanks to you. Having a wife as a nutritionist is a nice thing. It's also challenging at times, because I don't get to, I always have her like on my shoulder in my conscience. But where was I going with that? I think there's a bit of a reciprocal relationship there from my experience, but I think it was more less psychosomatic, but more based in a physiological response to what I was eating at the time.
Yeah.
And does that sound right to you, based off your understandings, that there can be that reciprocal relationship with anxiety and stomach issues?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
And really kind of the more coming from the way I view the world is through food and nutrition. So problems are usually from that kind of start, but there really truly is a two-way street between the gut and our brain. So, the feelings that we experience, those can actually start from the gut bacteria that we have. And that's because optimally, with optimal gut health and when we have a robust, diverse microbiome, which would encompass lots of different diverse strains of bacteria and even protozoa or parasites even can naturally be there, but within a balance. There's a really good balance of really healthy bacteria. And when it's healthy, that ecosystem does a lot of things for our health. The number one that has to do with our mood is that most of our serotonin and other neurotransmitters are actually created by the bacteria or the microbiome. So they are started that process of those neurotransmitters, as well as we have a lot of receptor sites of those neurotransmitters in our gut. So that's why we actually physically feel some of those experiences, those feelings in our gut when we're getting anxious to get on stage or
butterflies in the stomach.
Mm-hmm, exactly. So the other things that our gut health, a healthy, robust microbiome will do for us is it'll produce different vitamins and nutrients that we can't get a lot from food potentially, or we can't digest fully. So those are things like B vitamins and fat soluble vitamins like vitamin K, which has been shown to be a cofactor for vitamin D. And many people are deficient in vitamin D, as we're seeing with like COVID. There's correlations with low vitamin D.
Well, yeah, being
levels.
In that place of the deficiencies there, and you mentioned that gut dysbiosis earlier. Mm-hmm. In a nutshell, will you kind of set the stage for key variables? I know that there's many, but kind of like the key variables nutritionally that cause gut dysbiosis.
Yeah, definitely. So there are a lot of contributing factors and variables. The first thing to understand is that we get our microbiome from our mothers and then from their mothers. So it's passed on generationally from vaginal births and breastfeeding. So with the higher rates of C-sectional births, and there was an era where I think my grandmother didn't actually breastfeed my mom and her siblings because it wasn't as popular. It was kind of it wasn't well known how important it was at the time, and so there's some people who can't breastfeed because of lack of nutritional content to produce enough milk for the baby. All of that sets the stage for the inoculation of our gut microbiome. On top of that, a lot of antibiotic use, excessive antibiotic use in the medical, conventional medical world has depleted our good microbiome, good bacteria as well as the bad bacteria. And when we take an antibiotic, unfortunately, sometimes it might be necessary, but it's important to weigh the risks. And there are a lot of cases of people being on chronic antibiotic use. And at that point, it's really unhealthy because you're only creating a better space for opportunistic bad guys to grow and repopulate faster than the good guys. As well as different foods that we eat will, like in the industrial era, in the early 1900s, refined sugar, refined flours, and toxic seed oils have started to really seep into every single food item that we consume. I know that growing up, that's primarily what I ate, were processed foods. And actually, not all of the time, but there's an abundance that most people are consuming, and those three create a lot of dysbiosis and issues within the gut bacteria.
And that dysbiosis then is unhealthy, too many unhealthy bacteria. This is very simplistic understanding, but too many unhealthy bacteria, not enough of the healthy bacteria.
Yeah. So going back to what optimal health of your bacteria would look like, if you have enough of the good resilient guys, and there's not a lot of, you haven't had all of these different things that have harmed your gut, this ecosystem of microbes are actually a real good source of nutrition and support to your body. So we are like the hosts of lots of different bacteria, and we need them actually, just like they need us. So symbiotic relationship. But once our nutrition goes awry, when we start to get malnourished, potentially if we're sick, if we get sick and we take antibiotics, then that sets the stage for these opportunistic bacteria to be more of a source of toxicity. And that's what we see the most, is that these opportunistic bacteria, they normally would provide us vitamins and nutrients and healthy amounts of neurotransmitters, as well as toxin and toxin protection, as well as like they would help us metabolize and keep out different viruses that we might get exposed to. And they would also help our hormones regulate better. So we'd have a robust libido and things like that, and metabolism would be running really well. But once it becomes a source of toxicity, none of those things are working as well. And that really affects our health. We start to see anxiety. We start to see low libido and metabolic dyshealth, us, gaining more weight. And these also, we get malnourished, and that contributes to, again, the cycle, really. Yeah, it's easier to ruin your microbiome in our modern world because of such an abundance of these things that would harm it. Naturally, our body would be completely able to combat these types of things, like the toxins or potentially a invading bacteria that might make us sick, if we were healthy and not undergoing so much stress.
Yeah, I think it's been my experience that healing my gut has been similar to exercise, being in good shape. You get out of shape so quickly if you miss a week of running, if you're a runner, or at the gym. It's like that next week you're feeling it, right? And if I opt for processed foods, if I go out to eat more, we have our diets really dialed in, I notice my digestion is a bit off, and I wonder if that strengthening of the gut bacteria is similar, analogous to strengthening muscles and muscle health.
I think so, yeah. So it really comes down to the different types of cells we have in our whole body. They all have different timelines for like how long they live, and then they're removed, and it's called like mitosis. So it's the process, the life cycle of every cell, and it's all different. Your heart cells live different time lengths than your liver cells. So within your intestinal lining, those cells actually only last 3 days, and so they regenerate very quickly. So ideally we can provide really good nutrition for those to heal, because that can be part of dysbiosis. Those cells start to get really like shriveled up, and they're not as lively, or they don't function quite as well. So that's where all of your absorption of nutrients comes from. And the problem really is that those cells are also very much nourished and dependent on the environment of the ecosystem around it. Just like we are finding out more and more that as individual humans, we are very dependent on our own environment, and being outside in nature has a different impact on our mood than being around a lot of technology and isolated, right? So our environment does play a huge role in our own health, as a whole. But then on the cellular level, those intestinal cells are very dependent on the ecosystem and environment of the microbiome. And so it does take a lot longer we only know, so this is an interesting statistic, the Human Microbiome Project has only identified 50% of what exists in our gut microbiome. So there's still 50% of bacteria that we have no idea what they are and what they do necessarily for us. And there's always a good and bad side to most bacteria. There's not a lot of bacteria that's only bad. A lot of it is really gray there. So so knowing that there's a lot of diversity in the gut microbiome, it can take a lot. We only know a small amount of it at this time. And we really have to lean on ancestrally, how people have had health in response to their healthy microbiomes, using the specific foods that those ancestral peoples ate. And that's what I usually have found to be the best way for people with IBS or even anxiety, mood issues, as well as inflammatory, autoimmune disorders, things like that. So it's really finding the ancestral foods and mimicking that for some time, so that we can rebuild, really kind of going back to when you were a baby and rebuilding your gut microbiome from the bare bones. Yeah,
that reminds me of, I follow Dr. Paul Saladino's work, and he recently he leans on anthropology as well as scientific literature, and there is a lot of scientific literature that guides us in the direction that we should head in terms of what foods to consume, what foods to omit. But he also, there's these areas of complexity, right? There is still unknown, and he recently visited the Hadza tribe in Tanzania, and based off his experience, there was very good gut health. There wasn't anyone complaining about IBS symptoms, right? There was anxiety too. He said there was very little anxiety. There was just such a relaxed state in terms of how they approach food, how they approach each other, how they approach child rearing. And so if people are wanting to work towards healing their gut, some of our listeners are clinicians, some people just interested in health and wellness. What are some key tips of foods to really focus on incorporating into the diet to help build that gut health?
Yeah, great question. Actually, I was going to mention, one of the big things that most people think of when it comes to gut health and what they're told is to eat more fiber is like the go-to recommendation. And when we think of fiber, we think of pasta, we think of bread, we think of roughage, really, really rough stuff, right? So that we're eating kale, maybe. And not that any of those things are bad, but what I've found is when we look at the studies that show this is what people, might be eating that have really healthy microbiomes in our country, right? When they look at the human microbiome study, they compare it to indigenous communities, they say that people with really healthy microbiomes have more fiber in their diet. And I think that's great when someone already has a healthy microbiome. And what the approach that I use is the gut and psychology syndrome, as well as the gut and physiology syndrome by Dr. Natasha Kimmel McBride, abbreviated GAPS, the GAPS nutrition protocol. And there are different stages really that we have to go through to bring an unhealthy microbiome to a healthy microbiome. If an unhealthy microbiome person starts to eat a bunch of fiber all of a sudden, they're probably going to have just an increased amount of their symptoms, because that fiber feeds good bacteria, but also bad bacteria. And when we have an overgrowth of that bad bacteria, you're primarily feeding the opportunistic bad bacteria. And so there was actually a study on Paul Saladino's that was introduced to by Paul Saladino that confirms this, that it was an interventional study that compared the use of a high fiber diet to increased amounts of fermented foods in your diet. And they looked at constipation and whether or not that was improved. And they found that the high fiber component of that subgroup of people, they actually had an increased amount of inflammatory markers in their blood and worse pain in their stools. And they didn't actually see an improvement of gut bacterial diversity, which is a hallmark of a healthy gut, is that you have more diverse bacteria. And then, so this second, the fermented foods group actually had a much better response, and they had an increased amount of bacterial diversity. So in the GAPS diet, fermented foods are a cornerstone, and you would introduce these very, very slowly.
And real quick, if you want to hear more about it was that study that you talked on in our last podcast, right?
I think it was a different study.
Oh,
that one was
study.
More on fermented foods and gut diversity with mood. It's more so associated with mood.
Well, if you want to learn more about that relationship,
we can link the
mood,
study.
Yeah.
Sorry. Well,
yeah, reference that podcast, and then we can link this study in the show notes too.
Yes, yeah, reference that last podcast for fermentation, more on fermentation and the benefits on your health and especially your mood.
Yeah, but so fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, beet kvass, kombucha. These are helpful with gut diversity.
Yes. Perfect. And then the second major cornerstone food is, something called meat stock. And there's a lot of people who understand what bone broth is these days because that's really popular, which is great. But bone broth differs from meat stock in that it's cooked for a much longer period of time. And just within the GAPS diet, it's much more effective to use meat stock instead of bone broth. What we find is people have sometimes more neurological issues with drinking bone broth as opposed to starting with meat stock. So we call meat stock the sick person stock, and bone broth is more of a healthy person broth to use. And each and every person might be able to try both and see really which one they respond to the best. Also, we do the meat stock because it provides a lot of nourishing amino acids, which are just proteins to help with rebuilding. We need a lot of protein to help rebuild those cells in our intestines, and our probiotics actually can feed off of those amino acids too, and feed the good guys primarily. So that's really, really important to reversing kind of the nutritional deficiencies, because once those cells are really nourished with this meat stock, then we can actually absorb more from the food that we're eating and broaden the food groups that we're eating. Some people have a lot of sensitivities, and this really helps. And then a third cornerstone are, non-starchy vegetables, which are in this category of easy to digest foods. So especially people with IBS, the non-starchy foods are going to be the best, because there are certain carbohydrates that are starchy, which would include, yams, sweet potatoes, beans sometimes, and then definitely grains, where these starches will actually ferment and feed those opportunistic bacteria. So it will aggravate some of those symptoms for someone with IBS to eat a lot of starches in their diet, a lot of grains in their diet, a lot of fiber in their diet. So we eat easy to digest non-starchy foods like lots of different greens and carrots, winter squash, zucchini, asparagus, radishes, mushrooms, lots of different types of vegetables. And fruits can be also well tolerated at times. And then we are, as a second note to the easy to digest foods, cooked food is often much easier to digest for individuals with digestive symptoms. So making sure there's a lot of, soups and roasted, sauteed, cooked foods. And the last cornerstone, that I'm always talking about that are part of the GAPS diet is, very nutrient dense meats. And meat in our society is often just thought of as the muscle meat, right? You get it like nice steak and eat that all the time. That's not the emphasis. That's muscle meat, and muscle meat is actually the less nutrient dense part of the animal. And there are all these other different parts of the animal that we can consume. It's the big idea, kind of movement right now is eating nose to tail, and that includes meat stock as well as the fats of the animals, which actually provide a lot of vitamin K and vitamin D and vitamin A, which are hard to find in other sources of food. And then the organs, which if you are heebie-jeebie about organs, then, supplements that provide those dried organs as a supplement form are much, much more tolerated for kids and even adults.
And so these other cuts of meat, are we talking about roasts, ribs, those sorts of fattier meats are good? And I know that meat stocks, you're often using like bones with the cartilage tissue,
marrow,
and fat and marrow.
Yeah. So for sure, there's lots of different gelatinous tissues and ligaments that hold together the bones and meat, different muscles together. And so those are, chuck roasts, different types of roasts with a bone in is really preferred. And you slow cook them just in the oven or in a slow cooker, and makes it nice and tender and flavorful.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to mention is, for me, it's kind of been easy because you've just led the charge within our relationship we eat at home and learning to make meat stock, ferments, which, types of foods are more quality. And I'm imagining some of our listeners might be a little overwhelmed with, all of these steps to take and, ways to really optimize gut health and move towards this ancestral diet. But I know even, for us, it's just taken, and it's really helpful if you have a friend or a family member who's on this journey with you of incorporating more whole, local, organic meats and vegetables into your diet, because you kind of feed off of each other. Like at one point we took a stand against sugar and threw away all the sugar in our house into the dumpster, and that was actually a pretty pivotal moment because we really we still eat sugar, mostly in the form of honey now, but we've made significant shifts, and know that similar to one's bouts with mental health issues, one's bouts with physiological issues related to nutrition. It's a long journey, and so I always encourage my friends and family, to just take a step, and we know with neuroscience research, when you make a shift in habit, to cooking once a week at your house, right, instead of going to a fast food restaurant or just a restaurant, because you're going to get the bad oils and all of those settings. You start to develop habits, and cooking these. It not only is good for you nutritionally, but it's also just a healthy habit, and it's relaxing in and of itself. So there's just multiple benefits in making these incremental steps, away from sugar, away from processed foods, and towards whole, organic, locally sourced meats and vegetables.
Yeah. Yeah, just like to reiterate with all the new things that we try with, when you start working out again, and it's just that first step tends to be, it's just the hardest. It's a brand new thing that you're trying, and I really try to encourage people to really take things one step at a time, add in these cornerstone foods first. And the first I would even start with is meat stock, the stock from making a meat stock and with the bones and things like that. And you can find recipes online for that, and videos even, to help walk you through each step of that process. And that will just get you started. The first time you do it, you'll figure out where you need to make some changes and learn from that, and keep building off of it. And the changes can be slow. I think that's one of the hardest parts with gastrointestinal issues sometimes is, occasionally we have like a very quick response, but if someone's been dealing with this for a long, long time, it does take some time and commitment to really see it through. So give it, 6 months at the least to really, go for it, to do some of these things, and get help if you need to, and a community of support to encourage you along the way.
Well, one other thing that I was just thinking about that I really appreciate about your approach to nutrition, health and wellness in general is, I was talking with Cuckoo, my grandpa, in a recent episode, and he was talking about like the continual evolution of himself as a person of the therapist work, what values he has, and moving towards like expression of his inner child, and it reminds me of a bit of your approach with nutrition. Is we live in times where even nutrition is so polarized, right? There's so much in our society that's polarized right now, politically, all sorts of different topics, and nutrition is no exception to that rule. We have people very adamantly, campaigning for a plant-based diet. We have people campaigning for a carnivore diet, but the reality is most people the optimal macronutrient ratio is going to be somewhere in the middle. And so I've appreciated that evolution that I've seen with you, with just continuing to take steps. I think that that's just such a helpful message for me, and I've heard that helpful for others too, of just that continual journey. Irvin Yalom's fellow journey. We're all journeying together in these different spheres of health, and it's all about just continuing to take those incremental steps our whole lives amidst the effects of the foods of modern commerce, and narrative therapy, dominant societal narratives, the normalization of judgment that Foucault talks about. So we're bombarded on all of these fronts with judgment, with assaults from toxins to our bodies, and it's just this lifelong healing process that we can all, like you're saying, do in community. That's what I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, we should definitely talk on another podcast on each, like your story and my story individually, and just look at the similarities there with most people's health journeys, nutritionally speaking, as well as with, psychological wellness.
Yeah, there's so many
community is a big component, as well as that lifelong journey kind of mentality. And that would be a really fun talk to get into as well.
Yeah, well, we're about at the end of the time of the interview, and the last question I'll pose to you is, what's a message of hope you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Yeah, I think that I just said this to a patient just yesterday who has actually IBD, ulcerative colitis, and has been suffering for almost a whole year of constant diarrhea. And I just kind of shared with him that there is hope, and that especially with the nutrition elements, people have been using food as medicine longer than medicine existed. And that's what medicine is based on, is actually food. So I just really want to give people that hope, that there is hope, and vitamin hope. I got that from Dr. Terry Walls, who healed herself of an autoimmune disease through food and similar foods to the GAPS diet. And it's just, that is the message that I want to leave people with, because these physical ailments that we live with are connected to our wellness, our mental health, and we can do something about it. We can think differently, and that helps too. We can, go to therapy and change the narratives that we have about our experiences. And at the same time, we have to face the reality of what our bodies are sharing with us. If there's pain, if there's discomfort, if there's anything, that is just bothering you, ask yourself, what is it that your body's telling you?
No, that's good. And if people want to get in touch with you, where's the best place to direct them?
I would say my website has lots of resources. Those recipes that I kind of mentioned on meat stock and getting started with those things are on my blog. That's www.nutritionwithconfidence.com. And then I'm also active on Instagram and Facebook, and that's at Nutrition with Confidence.
Perfect. Well, thanks for being on the podcast today, Natalie.
Thanks, Andrew.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, This podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.